Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. The topic of this session will be to check or not to check. One of the common mistakes of beginner players is that they see a check and they think it is an achievement in itself and they definitely want to give it. Well, that's certainly not so, because there are some checks that are good and there are others that don't make any sense. However, at all times you should be aware of the possibilities that are a check, whether you are to give it or your opponent. Well, we'll go through 10 different examples in this lesson to show when checks are a good idea, they work, they lead to gain of material or even checkmate. And we'll see some examples also where the check itself is a mistake. Well, let's get to it and see the first example. Here we are. In this position, it was white's turn. Right now we see each side having equal number of pieces other than pawns, because white does have an extra pawn. Generally, it's a good idea to start with having a sense of the position as of material concern. Like right now, here we can tell that each side has a rook, a bishop, a knight, and then at last we deal with the pawns because they are the least valuable of all the pieces. Then the next thing we should look at, is there anything that we can capture on our next turn? In this particular case, the only thing we almost can capture is our opponent's bishop, but in reality we cannot capture it because our bishop on g3 is pinned. And when a piece is in an absolute pin, like it is here, that means that piece cannot move. It's forbidden to move. Well, on the other hand, we can use that very same element to our advantage in this case. Not only that our bishop is pinned because of black's rook on h3, so is the black bishop on e5. That bishop right now can only move in this direction, but not in the other diagonal towards a1 or h8. And that's exactly what white can take advantage of. Giving a check with a knight would be certainly a check, but definitely not a good one, as the black pawn would simply capture it. In addition to that, the only other checking possibility is with the rook. And this is a tricky one, because at first it may seem that the black bishop would capture it, but at a closer look you'll discover that that's illegal, because it would expose the black king to the attack of white's bishop on g3, and that is not allowed by the rules. So therefore this is a good check, because it attacks the black king, but it also attacks at the same time the black knight on g6. So we already learned the bishop cannot capture the rook, so therefore the black king needs to move, and pretty much doesn't matter which square the king moves to, the white rook will be now free to capture the free knight and be a piece ahead. Okay, let's move on to our next example in this lesson. Here we go. In this position, it is black who is up a bishop at the moment. And in fact, black has some real serious threats in giving a check with the bishop on c1 and then start chasing the king after the king gets out to a2, come in with the queen also to check, and checkmate would be very nearby. And in fact, that's exactly what would happen if white promotes the pawn. Black would give the check, the king would get out, and then the queen would give the check, and when the king gets out, finally checkmate. Wow, that wouldn't be fun. Even though white has two queens on the board, it is still black who is winning the game. So going back to the beginning, we'll see that white has a better choice. But remember, we were talking about checks. How on earth can white give a check even in this position? Well, I have to say this is a rather tricky one. And in order to achieve success, white must under-promote. That means the pawn should promote to a knight and not a queen. There are some rare situations when that is the superior choice of promotion of the pawn. Right now, it doesn't give black the time to play bishop c1 check because the knight is attacking the king, and once the king moves out, knight captures queen, and white is in business. What a nice example. Let's move on to the next example. Here we are. In this endgame, we have again even material, and white having a pair of bishops. And this is a perfect example how the pair of bishops can be so powerful, because they can control so many squares, and in this case, some very crucial ones. We can see white's dark squared bishop on b2 is pasting through important squares also around black's king. In fact, the black king has only one potential escape square, and that is at f7. And now look at this. After white puts the second bishop also on a diagonal attacking black's king, in other words giving a check, black gets into serious trouble because the king has no moves, so therefore black must block the check. Blocking the check with the knight is no help whatsoever because the bishop would simply capture it on d5, or if the rook blocks, which is relatively the best choice, then of course white is free to capture the rook, which is a clearly more valuable piece than the bishop, which white would be giving up. Also, it's worth mentioning that white is in no terrible rush in capturing this rook, as this rook cannot move away. For example, white could proceed instead by playing rook to d7, entering to the 7th rank to attack black's pawns on the queen side. And only when black would play king f8, which would unpin the rook, so now the rook would be ready to run away, now white would be ready to capture the rook, and when king captures the bishop, white already won an exchange, then white could win a pawn in addition to that. So we again saw how powerful this check was in this position. Again, it's always rather important to know your options where and if you can check. The next example will be similar in this sense. Right now it is white's turn again, and in this position it is black who has material advantage at the moment. We can see that black still has both rooks and white only has a bishop as compensation. So black is up an exchange at the moment. However, there is something unusual happening here. Namely that the black king on the h file does not have a pawn in front of it. And to make things worse, white doesn't have an h-pawn either. From black's perspective, actually, it would be better for black if white would have a pawn on the h-file, because then the black king wouldn't be so exposed. Well, with that hint, it's not hard to figure out what white should do now, and namely, white should check black's king. And there is only one way to do so, namely bringing the rook over from one corner to another. Now this check is really painful for black because the bishop on b3 is controlling the key g8 square. And therefore black can only block the check, but that would clearly be a significant loss of material for black. Let's move on to to a different situation. We're in an endgame where black seems to be clearly ahead, still having his queen on the board. It is white's turn, and the question is, what should white do? Well, white does not have a regular direct check. However, white actually has numerous discovered checks. What that means is that we're not giving a check with the piece that moves, but a different piece that's behind the piece that moves. So in this case, the check-giving piece will be our bishop on e1, while the piece which moves is the knight on d2. So what we can determine here is that if white moves the knight right now from d2 anywhere, that will be a check. So now what's important here is to combine several things. One is the obvious, to give a check, and the second one should be to attack something, preferably the opponent's most valuable piece. Now the beauty is, when we're giving discovered checks, generally we can put the piece en prise. That means that a piece which normally could be captured, now it cannot be captured because the black king is being checked also by white's bishop. So the black king must move, and then the queen is lost. A very nice discovery to gain a queen. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. In this position, for a change, it is black's turn. And the question is how to proceed. Black has two ways to give checks. One regular, simple, and one tricky one. But hopefully, in view of our last example, this will be a hint. Now here, the correct move is to give a discovered check by moving the pawn simply forward, and with that opening the diagonal to attack white's king. Now the white king cannot move, and white has only one legal move to block the check. And now black is ready to immediately use the pin. Of course, black could capture with the bishop the rook and gain an exchange. However, there is no need for black to lose the bishop for winning the rook. And this is a very important moment. When you see a good move, don't necessarily make it. There may be an even better one. And this is one of those situations when capturing the rook is okay, but it's much better to play a3 first and then capture it the move after, so black will maintain his bishop on the board. If we compare this move, d3, with the other check at disposal, we'll realize that this is much worse, because now the white king would simply get out, and even if we realize the discovery check now, it's not the same anymore, as the white king can start running the other direction, and white certainly has survived the worst. Let's go on and move to the next position. Here we are. Now this is again a totally different scenario from what we saw so far. Now it is black's turn, and we can clearly see that white has a far advanced dangerous passed pawn on h7, about to get promoted to a queen. The question is, what can black do about it? If black could control that promotion square h8, everything would be fine. However, the black king is just one square too far away. If the king would be on f6 or f8, everything would be fine. The king could go to g7, but it's not. Obviously, the black pawn is no help in this aspect, so the only hope that black has is the knight on c6. And again, here is what's really important, is that black has a check that can gain time to go en route to the key g6 square, which ultimately will control the promotion square of the h-pawn. So, in other words, black will play knight e5 check, using the moment that now white doesn't have the time to promote the pawn, must move the king out of check, and now we're ready, knight g6, and then black will simply follow up, for example king e4, move the king around, go attack the pawn, then capture it, and eventually black will win the game. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. In this position, it is black's turn, and white has just moved the queen to d6, with that attacking black's rook on b8, as well as the bishop on e6. Well, in such situation, there may be several ways to deal with it. One is that you may move one piece to protect the other. Can you think of a move in this position like that? Yes, it is moving the rook to e8 to protect the bishop. The problem with that is that after that, white will simply grab black's far advanced dangerous pass pawn. So that is not the best choice. But what else may black do instead? The other common way to get out of such a double attack is to move one of the two attacked pieces to give a check, and while the opponent is busy getting out of the check, then the other piece can move away. So in this case, black only has one such a move, namely moving the bishop to f5 with a check. The beautiful thing here is that it's even better for black than that, than just saving the bishop and the rook. Here, because black already has a far advanced passed pawn on b2, it actually means that the black is chasing out the white king from b1, the promotion square, and when the king moves out to a2, then of course black will not just move the rook away. It would be of course a big mistake to move the rook even with a check, because that would give up on the pawn on b2. But instead, naturally, black will simply promote the pawn to a queen with a check, and when king moves, black will checkmate right away. Let's move on to our next example. Here we are. And now we are seeing an example when black actually shouldn't give a check, or should be very careful. Here black gave the check with the rook on h4, seemingly an excellent move, looks like a skewer. The king moves away, and then rook captures rook, and black won a rook. However, have to be very careful. Always look out for discoveries, because they are very hidden, very tricky, but extremely powerful. Like in this case, it's true that white is in check, but by moving his king out, actually white is giving a so-called counter check. All of a sudden, we opened up the diagonal of white's bishop, and not only the white king is no longer in check, the black king is. And the problem is that once the black king moves out of the check, white is free to capture the rook on h4, and of course maintaining a significant material advantage. Let's go on. In this position, white has just blocked a check with the bishop on c3. And things seem to be pretty good for white, because now the queen is attacked, and if the queen moves away, the rook behind on f6 will be in trouble. But again, the point is you need to be always aware of various checking possibilities. And in this case, black can check with the knight. Knight moves to d1. It's a very important check because it attacks the bishop a second time, and in addition chases the king away from the bishop. So once the king moves, black can simply pick up the bishop, knight takes e3, and be an extra rook up. Let's move on to the next example. Here we go. In this position, the white rook is being attacked by black's bishop, and white should be careful what to do. There is a tempting check to give, but in reality it's a big mistake. White, if giving a check on e7, will lose, because the black king moves out of the check by attacking the white rook immediately. And now white is stuck, because in addition to the rook hanging, white also has a back rank problem. So regardless where the rook goes, the black rook will come down, and white can only delay checkmate by blocking the check with the bishop or the rook, and black simply captures that, and it's game over. So this is a perfect example that don't automatically give a check, even if it looks harmless like here. So what should white do instead? Well, white should keep the rook on the first rank for now, making sure to open up a little window, h3 or g3 for the king to escape, and only move your rook away from the first rank once you've done that. Let's move on to the next example. Here we go. In this example, white has a tiny material advantage, having a queen versus a rook and bishop. However, giving a careless check with queen c4 would ruin it all. At first it seems like a brilliant move because it checks the black king and attacks the black bishop simultaneously. Generally, this is a fork and a simple win for white. However, be aware of your opponent's possible counterattacks. In this case, black can block the check with the bishop, not only saving his own bishop, but at the same time pinning the white queen. What that means is that the queen cannot run away from the attack. Either will have to take the bishop, in which case, of course, black will remain up a rook, or basically let the bishop capture the queen, and neither way is very great for white. So what did we learn from all these different examples of checks? One thing is what you should remember. Regardless if the check is good or bad, you need to be aware of it. That's the first step, because checks can be very dramatic. A move that looks like check may even be checkmate. Or it may be a losing move, like we saw in the last couple of examples. But the main thing is, always look out, be aware of where the checks are for you and your opponent. I hope these examples helped a bit to point out to look in the right direction when it comes to your own games. Thanks for listening, and make sure to be back next week for some more chess ideas. So long until then. Bye-bye.